The look on my son's face changed so fast it almost would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. 1 second, he was striding through my front door with that confident, easy walk he'd had since he was a teenager, like the house already belonged to him. The next second, he stopped cold. His hand froze on the strap of his messenger bag. The woman, walking behind him, some attorney in a gray suit, bumped into his shoulder and he didn't even notice. Nobody said a word for a long moment. Daniel just stood there staring across my kitchen. "Dad," he finally said, and his voice came out smaller than I remembered it ever being, even when he was a kid. "What is he doing here?" I glanced over at Walter Briggs, who was sitting comfortably at my kitchen table. One hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, the other resting on a folder of his own. Walter didn't say anything right away. He just gave Daniel a small, calm nod. The kind of look you give someone when you already know how the conversation is going to end. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Afternoon, son. Glad you could make it." Daniel didn't answer. The color had drained clean out of his face, and standing there in my kitchen, staring at Walter like he'd seen something rise up out of the ground, my boy looked more rattled than I'd ever seen him in 31 years of life. Funny thing is, 4 months earlier, I would have given almost anything just to get him to come around for a Sunday dinner. Funny how things turn. My name is Russell Holt. I'm 69 years old, and I've lived in the same house outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, since the year Jimmy Carter was in office. For 38 years, I ran a small fleet of refrigerated trucks, hauling produce and dairy out of the Midwest down through Texas and back. Nothing glamorous, no corner office, just diesel fumes, pre-dawn departures, and drivers who showed up on time because I made sure they were paid on time. I started with one used truck I bought off a man in Sapulpa for less than it was worth because the transmission was shot, and I fixed it myself in my driveway with a manual and a case of beer for patience. By the time I sold the company, I had 19 trucks and drivers who'd been with me 20 years or more. Good men, reliable men. When I finally let it go, I figured life would slow down, and in some ways it did. I stopped setting an alarm. I started fishing the pond behind my property more mornings than not. I learned retirement isn't about doing nothing. It's about finally choosing what you do with the hours you've got left. Most Wednesdays, I'd meet my old friend Coy at a diner on Route 66 called the Wagon Wheel. Same booth by the window. Same waitress, a woman named Bernice who'd been pouring our coffee for 15 years and never once needed to ask how we took it. I drove the same Chevy Silverado I'd owned since before my hip surgery, dented on the tailgate, and it started every morning, which was all I asked of it. I never lived like a man who'd built something. Some folks like to show it off. I never saw the point. Unfortunately, somebody else noticed how quiet I'd gotten and decided that quiet meant something it didn't. My son. Daniel's 31. Sharp, good-looking, talks a good game. He and his wife, Brittany, live in a new development about 45 minutes from me, the kind with a name like Eagle Ridge Estates, even though there's not a ridge or an eagle anywhere near it. Big house. 2 new SUVs in the driveway. The kind of mortgage that keeps a man up at night if he's honest with himself, which Daniel rarely was. When Daniel was younger, we were close, especially after his mother passed. He was 14 then, an age where a boy needs his father more than he'll ever admit out loud. For years, it felt like the two of us were getting through it together. I coached his baseball team 2 seasons longer than I should have, knees and all. I drove him to college in Stillwater and cried in the truck on the way home, where he couldn't see me. I walked him through his wedding rehearsal and bit my tongue about Brittany more times than I can count. Then something shifted. Not all at once. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that's where it started. Just small things, the kind you only notice once they've stacked up high enough to cast a shadow. Phone calls got shorter. Father's Day turned into a text message with a thumbs up emoji. Visits thinned out to holidays, and sometimes not even that. When I called, he was slammed at work. When I suggested lunch, something always came up. At first, I told myself it was just life. Jobs get demanding. Mortgages get demanding. Kids, when they finally had one, get demanding. I understood all of that. But after a while, the pattern got too obvious to keep explaining away. Months would go by with barely a word. And then, out of nowhere, he'd call asking questions that seemed almost too specific to be casual. "How's the house treating you these days, Dad? You still keeping up with all the maintenance on your own? Ever think about something smaller? Something with less to manage?" Questions that sounded harmless enough on the surface. One night last fall, he called, while I had the Thunder game on. After some small talk that felt more like a warm-up act than actual conversation, he asked, "You still doing all your own banking and bills, Dad? Not letting it pile up on you?" The question landed strange, sideways, like a truck hitting a pothole you didn't see coming. I laughed it off. Who else would be doing it? No reason, just checking in. Then he changed the subject fast, talking about the weather, about Brittany's job. I didn't think much of it at the time. I wish to God I had. The call that really got under my skin came in early winter. A man named Curtis, who'd driven for me almost 18 years, phoned one Saturday morning just to catch up. We talked trucks and weather for a while, and then he got quiet in that way. Men get quiet right before they say something they don't want to say. "Russ, I probably got no business bringing this up, but you doing all right? Health-wise, I mean." I told him I was fine, better than fine. He hesitated again. "It's just, Daniel mentioned to a couple folks you'd been getting forgetful. Said he was worried about you living alone out there." I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking out at the bird feeder, hanging dead still in the cold. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. "Forgetful," I repeated. Curtis sounded uncomfortable now, like he regretted opening his mouth. "I just figured you ought to know what's being said." That conversation sat with me for days. Not because I was furious, not yet, because I was confused. And confusion has a way of rotting into something worse if you let it sit too long. A week after that, Daniel called. And for the first time in months, he sounded almost cheerful, almost like the boy I remembered. He asked about my health, my finances, my plans for the spring. Then he suggested coming by, not alone, with someone who could help get my paperwork organized. "Everybody needs this kind of thing handled, Dad," he said, like he'd rehearsed it. I agreed to the visit. But something in my gut, the same gut that had kept 19 trucks running on time and out of trouble for nearly 4 decades, told me something wasn't sitting right. The day finally came on a cold Saturday afternoon in February. I had coffee on, the good stuff, not the instant. The attorney arrived alongside Daniel, a woman named Patricia Voss, briefcase in hand, expression carefully neutral. And sitting at my kitchen table waiting beside me was someone Daniel never expected to see in his life again. The moment he stepped through that door, everything in the room changed temperature. He stared at Walter. Walter stared right back, calm as a man waiting on a fishing line to twitch. For the first time since this whole business had started, I understood that my son wasn't worried about my mind at all. He was worried about what Walter might already know. "Dad," Daniel said quietly, swallowing hard, "when did you start talking to him again?" I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time all day, I let myself smile. For a few seconds after Daniel asked that question, nobody in the room moved. Even Patricia Voss looked like she wanted to be somewhere else. Walter finally set his coffee mug down, slow and deliberate. "Good to see you too, Daniel. Been a long time." The tension in that kitchen could have powered every grain elevator in 3 counties. Daniel forced a smile that fooled exactly nobody. "I didn't realize you were back in the state." "Never really left," Walter said. "Just stayed out of the way." Patricia glanced between the 3 of us, plainly realizing she'd walked into something that had nothing to do with paperwork. Daniel recovered fast and changed the subject, introducing Patricia and explaining they only wanted to discuss some routine estate documents, things every man my age ought to have in order. I nodded along, exchanged a few stiff pleasantries, and then told them plainly I wasn't signing anything that day, not until I'd had time to read every line myself. Daniel didn't care for that answer. I watched it land on him. His shoulders went rigid. His smile dropped clean off his face. The meeting lasted maybe 15 minutes before they left. The second their car pulled out of my gravel drive, Walter looked at me and said, "Well, that went about how I figured it would." I couldn't argue with him. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork sitting unsigned on my table. It wasn't Patricia Voss and her careful, lawyered-up neutrality. It was watching the disappointment spread across my son's face when he realized I wasn't sitting there alone, confused and easy to steer. Not worried for me, disappointed in me. That look stayed with me long after his taillights disappeared down the road. People assume stories like this start with anger. Mine didn't. Mine started with confusion, then with a grief I couldn't quite name, then with a slow, unwelcome realization I spent weeks trying to talk myself out of. Walter Briggs wasn't some mystery man from my past. Not in the way Daniel had built him up to be in his head over the years. Walter wasn't a business partner skimming off the top. He wasn't trying to worm his way into anything that wasn't his. My wife Sandra died of a stroke 19 years ago, fast and without warning, on a Tuesday morning while she was watering her tomato plants. Some days it still feels like it happened last week. Other days it feels like it happened to a different man entirely. After Sandra passed, life shrank down to almost nothing. Work, bills, Daniel, sleep, repeat. I kept moving because stopping felt like it might finish the job grief had started. Walter helped me through those years. Not in any dramatic way you'd see in a movie. He just showed up. He ran the dispatch office when I couldn't focus enough to do it myself. He covered for me at meetings I couldn't sit through. Sometimes he'd bring over a six-pack and just sit on my porch without saying much of anything, which was exactly what I needed. That was the whole of it. Friendship, nothing more, nothing less. But 14-year-old Daniel saw it differently. Kids that age often do, especially grieving ones looking for somewhere to put their anger. He decided Walter was after something, my company, my house, my late wife's memory, take your pick. No matter how many times I explained it, that suspicion never fully let go of him. When Walter eventually retired down to Texas a dozen years back, Daniel seemed almost relieved. I figured time would wear that old resentment down to nothing. Apparently, I figured wrong. Truth was, Walter and I hadn't talked much in recent years beyond the occasional phone call and a Christmas card. Then, this past fall, everything changed. Not because of one big moment, but because of 100 small ones stacking up like cordwood. One evening, Daniel asked if I'd updated my will. A few weeks later, he wanted to know if I still handled my own online banking. Another time, he floated the idea of me giving someone power of attorney, just to be safe, just in case. Each question on its own sounded reasonable. Together, they started painting a picture I couldn't quite make out yet. Then came Curtis's phone call, the forgetfulness rumor. That conversation bothered me enough that I started paying real attention, the kind of attention a man pays when he suspects he's being measured for something. Around that same stretch of time, I noticed Daniel had gotten strangely curious about my finances. He never asked outright how much I had sitting in the bank. He wasn't careless enough for that. But he'd circled the subject the way a coyote circles a henhouse, looking for the weak board in the fence. One evening after we hung up the phone, I sat at my kitchen table staring at an old photograph, Sandra, Daniel, me, at the Tulsa State Fair back in 2009. Daniel grinning with cotton candy stuck in his hair. I had a thought that made my stomach turn. I wondered if my own son still saw me as his father, or if I'd quietly become something else to him. A line item. I hated myself for even letting the thought form. That's when I called Walter. We talked for almost 2 hours that night. At first, I just wanted an outside opinion, somebody who knew me well enough to tell me straight if I was imagining things that weren't there. By the end of the call, Walter had offered to drive up from Texas and help me go through everything with a clear head. Not because he thought Daniel was guilty of anything yet, because he thought I deserved to know the truth either way. 3 weeks later, he showed up at my door with a suitcase and a legal pad. The first thing he did was sort through my financial records, bank statements, the deed, my retirement accounts. The second thing he did was start asking the kind of questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Who had access to what? Who'd been asking around? Who'd shown a sudden, suspicious interest in things they'd never cared about before? As we worked through it, another piece surfaced almost by accident. An old driver of mine mentioned running into Brittany at a real estate investment workshop downtown. That didn't mean much on its own until a mutual friend mentioned Daniel had been overheard talking about being underwater on his second SUV. Then somebody else said something similar. A pattern started to form, the kind you can't unsee once you've seen it. Debt. Real debt. Nothing illegal, nothing criminal, just bad choices piling up on top of worse ones. A boat they barely used, vacations charged to cards they couldn't pay off, an investment in some friend's startup that went nowhere. The kind of trouble people keep hidden behind a good smile until they absolutely cannot hide it anymore. Even then, I didn't want to connect the dots. I kept hunting for some other explanation. Then Walter found something. One evening, he was sorting through a stack of old mail and bank notices when he stopped flipping pages and looked up at me with an expression I didn't like one bit. Russ. What? He slid a single sheet across the table. Take a look at this. The document itself wasn't anything dramatic. What mattered was the inquiry stapled behind it. Somebody had called a local bank asking detailed, careful questions about how a family member might go about gaining authority over an elderly parent's accounts under certain conditions. No names attached. No paperwork filed yet, just questions. But the date lined up almost exactly with everything else, and the woman who'd made that call had given her name as Brittany Holt. I sat there a long while without saying anything. Walter didn't push. He just let the silence sit there between us. Finally, I said, maybe they're just trying to plan ahead for me. Walter gave me a look that was more sad than anything. You really want that to be true? He wasn't wrong. I did want it to be true, because the alternative hurt in a place I didn't know I still had. That night, I barely slept. I lay there running every conversation from the past year back through my head, every question that had sounded a little too specific, every visit that had come with strings I hadn't noticed at the time. For the first time, I let myself see a pattern I'd spent months refusing to look at directly. And the deeper Walter and I dug, the clearer the shape of it became. My son and his wife weren't preparing for my future at all. They were preparing to take it over. The papers Daniel eventually brought looked harmless enough at first glance. That was what scared me most about them. They weren't some sloppy scheme cooked up overnight. They were clean, typed, organized in a navy folder, with little yellow tabs marking exactly where I needed to sign. If you only skimmed them, you'd think they were nothing but standard estate planning. And in plenty of families, maybe they would have been. But in mine, they read like a key being handed to me for a lock somebody else had already picked. Walter and I sat at my kitchen table the next morning, coffee going cold between us, reading through every single page twice. My house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft scratch of Walter's pen marking up a legal pad. He'd always had an eye for details most men missed entirely, a habit he carried over from running dispatch all those years, catching the one mileage report that didn't add up while everyone else signed off on it without a second look. That morning, he didn't say much at first, just read, reread, and circled a paragraph near the bottom of the second page. Russ, this gives Daniel a lot more control than he let on. I leaned in. How much control are we talking? Walter pushed his glasses up his nose. Enough to make decisions on your accounts, your property, your investments, if certain conditions get claimed. My stomach tightened up like a fist. Claimed by who? That, Walter said, is exactly the problem. We went through the language slowly. It wasn't dramatic. Legal documents never announce trouble with flashing lights. They bury it under words like prudent and best interest and reasonable judgment. But the meaning underneath was plain enough once you sat with it long enough. If I signed, Daniel could gain broad control over nearly everything I owned, under the argument that I needed help managing it. The papers weren't fake, they weren't outright criminal, but they were built wide open for abuse in the wrong hands, and I was starting to understand exactly whose hands those were. That afternoon, Walter called Patricia Voss directly, not to threaten her, not to accuse her of anything, just to ask straight questions. He put her on speaker while I sat across the table, arms crossed, trying not to feel like a fool in my own kitchen. Patricia sounded professional at first, careful, measured. Then Walter asked, Miss Voss, what exactly were you told about Russell's condition before you drew these papers up? A pause stretched out. Mr. and Mrs. Holt expressed concern about his ability to manage certain affairs going forward. I sat up straighter in my chair. Mrs. Holt being who? Walter asked. Brittany Holt, Russell's daughter-in-law. What kind of concern specifically? Another pause, longer this time. Some memory lapses. Confusion about bills. Possible vulnerability to scams. I looked down at my own hands resting on the table. Rough hands, scarred across the knuckles from decades of engine work and busted fingers from loading docks. They weren't a confused man's hands. They were just an old man's hands. Walter kept her on the line, calm as ever. Did you ever actually meet with Russell before drafting these documents? Patricia hesitated again. No, I was told this was time-sensitive and that he'd already agreed to it in principle. I almost laughed out loud right there at my own kitchen table. Not because any of it was funny, but because sometimes pain comes out sideways when it's got nowhere else to go. I had not agreed to anything in principle. I had agreed to listen to my son. There's a world of difference between those two things. After the call ended, Walter sat quietly for a moment before saying, She's not the villain in this. I know that. She might have been misled. Same as you almost were. Knowing that didn't make any of it sit easier. For the next several days, I carried those papers around in my head like a stone dropped in my coat pocket. I'd be brushing my teeth and suddenly think about Brittany on the phone with a bank, asking about authority over my accounts. I'd be standing in line at the Homeland grocery store and remember Daniel asking if I was still managing my own bills. I'd drive past the old dispatch lot on Highway 75 and feel my chest tighten up without warning. The strange part was, I still wanted to defend him. I kept building him excuses in my head. Maybe Brittany pushed him into it. Maybe he was scared about the debt and panicking. Maybe he'd noticed me forget one small thing and convinced himself it was the start of something serious. Maybe this whole mess had begun as real concern and curdled into something else along the way. That's what fathers do, I suppose. We keep hunting for the good version of our children, even after the evidence is sitting plain in front of us on the kitchen table. One night, I couldn't sleep at all. I got up around 2 a.m. and made toast I didn't even want, standing at the counter eating it in the dark like some sad bachelor in a commercial nobody asked for. On the refrigerator hung an old photograph of Daniel at 6 years old, missing both front teeth, holding up a bass he'd caught off the dock at Lake Eufaula, grinning like he'd just conquered the entire state of Oklahoma. I ran my thumb across the edge of that photo, and for one dangerous, exhausted moment, I thought seriously about just signing everything they wanted, just to make the whole conflict disappear, just to keep my boy close, even if it meant losing myself a little at a time to do it. That's the honest truth of it. Stories like this sound clean and certain when men tell them looking back. It wasn't clean. It was me standing barefoot on cold tile at 2 a.m, wondering how much of myself I was willing to hand over just to avoid admitting my own son might be using me. The next morning, Walter showed up with a folder of his own, looking worn down in a way that had nothing to do with being tired. The kind of tired that comes from finding out something you genuinely wished wasn't true. "Russ," he said, "you need to sit down for this one." I did. He laid 2 printed emails on the table between us. Nothing stolen, nothing illegal, just messages an old real estate friend of his had forwarded after Walter asked a few quiet questions. Daniel and Brittany had been asking around about my property, recent sale prices in the neighborhood, how fast a place like mine might move on the current market. They described it to the agent as just planning ahead. That phrase set my jaw tight enough to ache. Planning ahead. I sat there staring at those printouts. My house wasn't much to look at, but it was mine. Sandra had picked out every piece of wallpaper in that hallway herself. I'd poured the concrete for the back patio with my own 2 hands the summer Daniel turned 10. His height was still marked in pencil inside the pantry door from age 4 clear up through 17. And my son had been out there discussing selling it like it was a used trailer hitch. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a single thing. I just sat there at my own table and let it settle into me. Walter waited beside me without rushing it. After a while, he said quietly, "I'm sorry, Russ." I nodded. That was the moment whatever guilt I'd been carrying finally started to leave my body. Not all at once, but enough. I still love my son. That much never changed and never would. But love doesn't mean standing still while somebody measures the floor out from under your feet. By the time spring rolled around, I'd made my decision. Not just about the documents, about everything. The house, my money, what was left of my future. Most of all, I decided I was finished being treated like a guest in my own life. Still, I didn't want a shouting match. I didn't want lawyers slinging accusations across a conference table. I sure as hell didn't want one of those ugly family blow-ups where everybody storms off angry and nothing actually gets resolved. I wanted the truth out in the open, plain and simple, where everyone could see it for themselves. So, I planned a barbecue. Nothing unusual about that, at least on the surface. Every Memorial Day weekend, I hosted friends, neighbors, and family in my backyard, same as I had for 20 years running. Nobody thought twice when the invitations went out as usual. Daniel and Brittany accepted right away, which told me plenty on its own. They still believed I was going to sign. The day of the barbecue came up clear and warm, the kind of Oklahoma spring afternoon that makes you forget what an ice storm even looks like. Around 11, I got the smoker going, brisket and ribs, the smell drifting out across the whole property by noon. Kids ran around the yard with a garden hose somebody had turned into a makeshift sprinkler. My neighbor Hank spent a good 20 minutes explaining to anyone who'd listen why his tomatoes were outperforming everybody else's this year. Nobody had asked him. He told us anyway. For a few hours, everything felt almost normal. Almost. Underneath it, though, I could feel the tension sitting heavy in my chest the whole afternoon. Daniel and Brittany showed up around 2, Brittany carrying a store-bought potato salad like it was something she'd slaved over. Daniel shook my hand a little too firmly. Brittany hugged me, quick, too quick. Then her eyes started sweeping the backyard. Looking, checking, I noticed. I didn't say a word about it. Walter arrived a bit later, and the second Brittany spotted him across the yard, her smile went tight at the corners. Not enough for most folks to catch. Enough for me. The afternoon rolled along easy enough. People ate, talked, laughed at the same old stories. At one point, Hank told the exact same fishing tale he'd told 20 minutes earlier, word for word, and nobody had the heart to stop him. Normal, at least from a distance. By 5:30, most folks had eaten their fill, and the sun had started settling lower behind the tree line, stretching long shadows out across the grass. That felt like the right moment. I stood up and tapped a fork against my glass. Nothing dramatic, just enough to get the yard's attention. Conversations trailed off one by one until it was quiet. Everybody looked my way. I cleared my throat. Appreciate y'all coming out today. A few folks smiled, raised their glasses a little. I looked around at the faces in that yard, friends and neighbors who'd known me 30 years or more. Then I looked at Daniel. Walter and I have spent the last few months getting my affairs straightened out. I watched Daniel sit up ramrod straight. Brittany did the same a half second later. I kept going. I learned some things along the way I wasn't expecting to learn. The yard went quiet, real quiet. Nobody knew yet where this was headed. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't point a finger at anybody. I just laid it out plain. I explained how unsettled I'd gotten after hearing rumors floating around that I'd been losing my memory. A few heads turned toward Daniel. His face went still. Then I described the documents, the request for sweeping financial authority, the bank inquiry Walter and I had uncovered with Brittany's name attached to it. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing dressed up for effect. Just the facts, laid out one after another like cordwood. I could see people's expressions shifting as they took it in. Confused first, then uneasy, then concerned. Daniel finally cut in. Dad, that's not fair. I looked at him steady. Which part isn't fair exactly? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Facts have a way of being hard to argue with once everybody in the yard can hear them plainly. Brittany jumped in next. You're making this sound a lot worse than it actually was. I nodded slow. Then explain it to me. Right here. Silence. For just a second, I almost felt sorry for the two of them. Almost. Then Daniel made the mistake that changed everything. The kind of mistake a man only makes when he's cornered and nerves take over from sense. He threw his hands up and said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, Fine, but what happens to everything when you're gone? The second those words left his mouth, the entire backyard went dead silent. Even the kids by the sprinkler seemed to feel it. Daniel realized his mistake the instant it left his lips. Too late by then. You could practically hear the air go out of Brittany's chest beside him. Hank stopped chewing mid-bite. A neighbor near the cooler slowly turned away and studied the ground. And for the first time all afternoon, nobody had a single thing left to say, because Daniel had just put words to the exact thing everyone in that yard had been quietly thinking the entire time. I let it sit a few seconds. Then I spoke. Funny you'd bring that up. Daniel looked like he wished the grass would swallow him whole. I reached into a folder I'd set beside my chair. Not for theater, just because I wanted everything out in the open and documented. I sold the house. The words landed in that yard like a dropped wrench. Daniel blinked hard. What? Sold it back in February. Brittany stared at me. Dad, what are you even talking about? I came close to laughing, not because any of it was funny, but because their shock looked so genuine. They'd spent months planning around a piece of property that no longer belonged to me. Moved most of my money into an irrevocable trust 3 months back. Daniel's face went pale, the exact shade it had gone the moment he first spotted Walter sitting at my kitchen table. Then came the part neither of them was prepared for, the part I'd kept deliberately quiet until that exact moment. Walter isn't inheriting one dime of it. That got the whole yard's attention again. Even Walter looked a little amused by the timing. I kept going. He's just helping me manage the trust, same as he's always helped me manage things I couldn't handle alone. Daniel stared at me, lost now, desperate to make sense of it. Then I gave him the last piece. Most of what I've got left is going to fund scholarships for kids going into diesel mechanics and commercial driving right here out of Tulsa Tech. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The breeze moved soft through the oak trees behind the house. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked twice and went quiet. And all I could think about, standing there in my own backyard, was how light I suddenly felt after carrying that weight around for months. The suspicion, the disappointment, the gnawing uncertainty. Now it was finally out where everybody could see it. Daniel shook his head slow. Dad, why would you even do that to us? The answer came easier than I expected it to. Because those opportunities are what built my whole life, son. And because what's left of my future still belongs to me. He looked away from me. Tears came up in his eyes fast. For a second, I thought he might argue back, might try to defend himself one more time. Instead, he just stood up. Brittany followed him. Neither one looked at another soul in that yard. They walked together past the picnic tables, past the smoker, past 20 years of family memories scattered across that grass. Nobody moved to stop them. A minute later, I heard a car door slam, then another, then nothing but quiet. I watched their taillights disappear down my gravel road. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't chase after my own son. I didn't call out. I didn't apologize for a single word I'd said. I didn't try to fix something that was never mine to fix in the first place. I just stood there in the fading light and breathed. The morning after the barbecue, I woke up before sunrise, same as always. 38 years of trucking teaches your body to ignore whatever schedule retirement tries to hand it. For a few seconds lying there, everything felt ordinary. Then I remembered all of it at once. The barbecue, Daniel walking off, Brittany's questions still hanging in the air behind them. I stared at the ceiling a long while, waiting to feel triumphant about any of it. That feeling never came. That's something nobody tells you ahead of time about situations like this. Standing your ground feels right. Losing part of your family doesn't feel like anything good at all. Both of those things can be true at the same time, sitting right next to each other. A week later, I closed on a small place near Grand Lake, just under 1,000 square feet, one bedroom, a screened porch facing the water if you angle your chair just right. Nothing impressive. At my age, I wasn't chasing impressive anymore. I was chasing peace, plain and simple. Moving day felt strange in ways I hadn't braced myself for. Packing boxes, I kept stumbling across memories in places I wasn't expecting them. The hallway Daniel used to race his bike down before I made him stop. The kitchen table where he did his homework with his tongue between his teeth. The pantry door where pencil marks still tracked his height clear up through high school. I stood there staring at those marks longer than I'd ever admit out loud to anyone. Then I shut the door behind me. Some chapters deserve a certain amount of respect on the way out. They still have to close, though. The first few weeks at the lake house were quiet, real quiet. I started fishing again, not serious fishing, the kind where you spend more time thinking than you ever spend catching anything worth keeping. Most mornings, I'd take a folding chair down to the dock with a thermos of black coffee. Some days, I'd land a crappie or two. Most days, I caught nothing at all. Either way, I came back up to the house better than I'd gone down. I also started volunteering twice a week over at Tulsa Tech, teaching basics to kids learning diesel mechanics, the same trade that had carried me my whole working life. It turned out to be one of the better decisions I'd made in years. Those students reminded me of younger versions of the men I'd hired decades back. Some of them cocky and sure of themselves, some of them lost and just looking for somebody to believe they had something worth building. One afternoon, a 19-year-old kid named Marcus stayed late after class asking how I'd gotten my start in trucking. We sat and talked for the better part of an hour. Driving home that evening, it hit me that for months, I'd been so focused on protecting what I'd already built, I'd forgotten to think much about why I'd bothered building it in the first place. That realization felt healthier than just about anything else had in a long while. Daniel never called. Not in May, not in June, not in July. Part of me braced for anger, maybe a lawyer's letter showing up in my mailbox. Instead, there was nothing at all. Just silence stretching out week after week. And honestly, that silence hurt worse than any shouting match could have. People like their stories simple. Good man wins, bad man loses. Everybody ends up exactly where they deserve. Real life rarely cooperates that cleanly. Daniel wasn't some villain out of a movie. He was my son. The same little boy who once refused to take off his Halloween costume for 3 straight days because he thought the cape made him invincible. The same teenager who cried for an hour when our old dog died. The same young man who hugged me tight after his college graduation and whispered, "We did it, Dad." I couldn't erase any of those memories, and truthfully, I never wanted to. Several times that summer, I almost picked up the phone myself. Several times I got as far as dialing half the number before setting it back down. Not because I was still angry, because I knew whatever conversation came next had to happen for the right reasons this time. Not out of guilt, not out of fear of losing him for good, not because somebody needed something signed. 4 months after the barbecue, my phone rang on a Thursday evening while I was halfway through a plate of fried catfish, half watching the local weather report. The screen read Daniel. I stared at it a long moment before answering. "Hello?" A few seconds of silence passed. Then I heard his voice, quieter than usual. "Hi, Dad." He sounded nervous. Older somehow, not in years exactly, older in something harder to name. We talked awkward at first, about the weather, about a job he'd interviewed for, about nothing that mattered much at all. The way two strangers might talk at a bus stop. Then, slowly, the real conversation arrived. Daniel took a breath I could hear clear through the phone. "I was angry, Dad. I know you were. I felt humiliated, standing out there in front of everybody." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I know that too, son." A long pause stretched between us. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "I think somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as my dad. I just started seeing you as a problem to manage." The words hung there in my quiet little lake house, heavy and honest, and a little painful to hear out loud. I sat with it a moment. He kept going. Everything turned into numbers and plans and contingencies. I told myself I was just being responsible. I looked out my window toward the dark water of Grand Lake, the porch light catching the last bit of orange sinking behind the trees. For the first time in months, something loosened up in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something close to understanding. I wasn't perfect in all this either, I told him. That seemed to surprise him. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, I should have asked you harder questions a lot sooner than I did. Should have trusted my gut the first time it spoke up, instead of waiting on Curtis to spell it out for me." He let out a soft laugh, the first real one I'd heard out of him in longer than I could remember. Then his voice turned serious again. "I'm sorry, Dad." 3 plain words. No excuses tied to them, no conditions hanging off the back end, just a straight apology. I closed my eyes there in my kitchen chair. Some part of me had pictured that exact moment for months on end. Now that it had finally arrived, it felt smaller somehow than I'd imagined. And at the same time, it meant more than I knew how to say back to him right then. We stayed on the phone close to an hour that night. Not everything got fixed in one conversation, not even close. We didn't magically turn back into the family we used to be before all this started. Life doesn't hand you that kind of clean reset. Trust takes a lot longer to rebuild than it ever takes to tear down in the first place. But it was a start, a real one. Before we hung up, I told him something I'd been carrying around in my chest for a long while. "You never lost your father, Daniel. Not for one day through any of this." The line stayed quiet on his end. I added, "But my life was never yours to manage, son. It's still mine." He didn't argue back. He just said, quiet and steady, "I understand that now, Dad." After we hung up, I sat out on the porch a good while, listening to the water moving against the dock pilings in the dark, wondering what Sandra would have made of all of it. Probably that family is complicated no matter how you slice it. And that love, real love, sometimes needs boundaries drawn around it to survive. I think she'd have been right about that, same as she usually was about most things. Growing older has taught me a handful of things worth holding on to. One of the most important is this: you can love somebody with your whole chest and still protect yourself from them at the same time. Those two things aren't enemies of each other. More often than not, they're partners walking the same road. The truth nobody tells you ahead of time is that the smartest kind of revenge was never about hurting anybody back. It's about refusing to hand over your own dignity, standing your ground calm and steady until the other person finally sees, clear as daylight, exactly who they let themselves become. Daniel and I still have work ahead of us. Maybe we always will, and I've made my peace with that. But these days, when he calls, I pick up. And when I drive over to see him and Brittany, I go because I want to, not because I'm scared of losing him if I don't. That's a far healthier place for both of us to stand, and I mean to stay there as long as I've got left. Protecting yourself and loving someone deeply are not two separate choices, they can be the same act. Russell never stopped being a father. even when he had to stand his ground like a man protecting everything he'd built with his own two hands. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the people you care about is refuse to disappear quietly. Hold on to your dignity and trust that the ones worth keeping will find their way back. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted purely to entertain and to share a little something worth carrying with you into your own life.